So, just to take you through this second aspect of the timeline, um, which brings us sort of more up to the arrival of what we'll be calling the Troika. A little bit more about them later, but just in terms of what the government was kind of trying to do prior to the arrival of the Troika, which would happen in 2010. We have this plan to capitalize the banks, to try to deal with the bad assets, and also to deal with the liabilities that were owed to the bondholders, so to speak. So the government had basically kind of three things to do. Now, the capitalization had to come first. The government's course was going to be a bit controversial. So why is that? On December 14th in 2008, the government announced a 10 billion euro plan, which was targeted towards basically, again, making sure that the banks had the ability to extend credit to everyday businesses, really more than anything else. And it was going to do this by drawing money from the National Pension Reserve Fund, which is something the government had sort of squirreled away and set aside during the good years of the Celtic Tiger boom. But there was a lot of controversy going on in and around then. And what I really want you to sort of think about here is what impression this would have made to the public at the time. I can't exaggerate this. People were just amazed, I think, first of all, at what was going on, but also, frankly, furious, because it revealed a lot of what they had sort of suspected, which was that there was corruption and that the government was really kind of running the show on behalf of powerful banking interests in the country, not unlike the kind of arguments that Bernie Sanders or even Donald Trump would have made about Goldman Sachs and Hillary Clinton, for example, and other sort of associated powers here in the United States. So one of the things that's going on here at the time, when the government's trying to capitalize the banks right at the very end of 2008, is this massive revelation that Anglo-Irish Bank had issued loans worth some 84 to 100 million, a lot of money now in fairness, to its own chairman, Sean Fitzpatrick, otherwise known as Shawnee Fitzpatrick. Now, to avoid shareholder discovery, what Sean Fitzpatrick had done, because this was unethical, he had been doing this for years apparently. Every time it was sort of audit time, he would transfer his loans from Anglo to another Irish institution, Irish Nationwide, who we mentioned before, who were also in trouble at this time, but it was a smaller bank. But anyway, prior to the bank's audit, then Anglo would transfer the loans over, so these loans would not appear on Anglo's books. And then once the audit had been taken place, the loans would be transferred back. And he'd been doing this for like about 8 years. So these revelations infuriated people, and they also, I think, were furious about the fact that the government didn't seem like it was taking it seriously, right? The regulator didn't really kind of cause a ruckus over this. And so this kind of made it unclear what exactly the government's objectives were in recapitalizing the banks. Because, yeah, you could see a logic to recapitalize the retail banks, the banks that deal with ordinary people and ordinary businesses. It was harder to see the logic when it came to these large property banks, because it turns out that of the 10 billion or so that had been set aside, Anglo was going to get 1.5 billion of the capitalization deal. Now, this was really controversial. It was a well-known Irish economist, Morgan Kelly, who's quite a serious guy. If David McWilliams is kind of a pop economist, Morgan Kelly's an actual academic economist. And he argued that basically this guy's not a left-wing guy at all, right? So let's get that out of our heads. But basically he called the government out. He said, you guys are prioritizing protecting the banking elite, right? Now, why would you be doing that? Well, because the banking elite are connected to the property development elite, right? Who are their buddies. And they are, birds of a feather. So why is that significant? Well, because this property development elite is the donor base of the main party in the country, which is Fianna Fáil. And so you're giving them capitalization rather than addressing the credit needs of the actual population, which would be served through the retail banks. So obviously, strike one, majorly controversial. Now move on to the assets side. On the asset side, you have the government establishing something called NAMA, the National Asset Management Agency. Now, what's NAMA got to do with anything, right? It's a bad bank that's being set up, very, very similar to the TARP program that got set up here in the United States after 2008. And the goal there, as the goal here, is to try to roll up all the non-performing loans from the Irish banks, that is the money that's owed to the Irish banks from their borrowers, and put them in a bad bank, right? Because remember, the property bubble has collapsed and a lot of these assets are going to be, in negative equity, frankly. So what Lenihan had argued, the Minister of Finance, was that the government was going to buy up some 77 billion of bad property loans from Irish banks. Now, they wouldn't be worth zero, but they would not be worth necessarily 77 billion. In fact, the figures suggested that the government was actually paying about 7 billion over what the market rate for them would have been in that very negative, but once the bubbles burst, you have what's called fire sale pricing, which is like where everything's got to go. Everything's on sale. So the government was paying over the odds. Why? Because the government was basically saying, we believe that when the market recovers, these properties will be worth more than these fire sale prices represent. So we're willing to pay over the odds because we believe in the long-term economic value of these properties. So people are very critical of the move. A number of established Irish economists published a letter in the Irish Times arguing that the government was being far too optimistic in its appraisal of the state of the Irish economy at this point in time, and that this new bank really is just going to be a zombie on life support at the taxpayer's expense. And effectively what that meant was the taxpayer was being used to pay what was effectively a reward to the banks for the losses they had made in what was ultimately very speculative lending. And then worse, they weren't passing any of the losses onto the bondholders who, as I mentioned earlier on, especially these subordinated bondholders, who were going to be, frankly, owed money beyond the final value that could be extracted from the equity, right? So the bondholders were going to get money back for having invested into property way over the value of what they were worth. So you have this 2 for 2 now, right? You've got capitalization on the table with money going to the wrong people. You've a bad bank for bad assets that's maybe, protecting bondholders unnecessarily. And then you have to have this third aspect, which is what do you do about Anglo? What do you do about this insolvent commercial bank? So the government's not going to have a lot of latitude for action here. But in January 2009, the Dáil passed the Anglo-Irish Bank Corporation Bill, which effectively nationalised the bank, right? Now, this had to happen at that point in time because of the liquidity situation being shown actually to be, much worse than that. It wasn't an illiquidity situation at all. They were broke, basically. So the state all of a sudden now has become a major shareholder in this bank. It's become an owner of a bank, which is not something a state normally wants to be doing, and it actually had to become shareholders in other institutions as well. So there's a kind of what the economists that were critical of this were arguing was this was a nationalization by drift, right? That effectively the whole banking system was kind of slowly coming in under government ownership in one way, shape, or form. And to make a long story short, as 2010 proceeds, the extent of the bank's debts, remember I'd said to you earlier on, they weren't really known, they start to become more real. And then for those of you who know your little bit of recent history on this, Greece was also having trouble. And so in 2010, international lenders are looking at the market going, oh my God, Ireland's in trouble, Greece is in trouble, this is terrible. So it's going to become very, very hard for a country like Ireland with this terrible GDP, terrible budget deficit, which is now 32% of GDP, to borrow at all. So the country basically is now in a credit crunch on the international markets. It cannot get the money, it can't get a loan of money to take care of the bondholders that it's committed to. So, and the collateral's worth nothing. So the Central Bank of Ireland has to really think of an emergency strategy here. And so it goes to the European Central Bank and tries to get the European Central Bank to cover the loan books with what's called emergency liquidity assistance, which is something we've talked about a couple of weeks ago. But here is emergency liquidity assistance in action. Technically, it's illegal, right? Because if you're going to give liquidity assistance, i.e. bills that are worth something to these broke banks to help them cover the bondholders, then you're effectively printing money, right? And the only people that are supposed to be able to print money in the European Union is the European Central Bank. But the Irish Central Bank, supposedly an outlet of the European Central Bank since the ECB was introduced, is going to be doing this, right? Now, legally, you're not supposed to be doing it unless the bank is solvent, right? And just facing some temporary liquidity problem. But, excuse me, the Irish banks are, basically Ireland has, the nation has no choice at this stage. So the governor of the central bank, Patrick Honohan, he goes to meet with the Troika institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission to discuss options. And what we didn't know then, but what subsequently emerged a few years later, was that the European Central Bank were basically, forgive my French, pissed, right? I mean, they did not want this to happen. And in order to allow or to give permission for this borderline illegal operation to take place, they are going to take what Shakespeare would have called a pound of flesh, right? So you can do your emergency liquidity assistance if you want, Ireland, but what we're going to do instead here is we're going to basically mandate that you allow us in to basically take over the management of your economy for a few years. And we're going to attach serious conditions to you having this loan. And this is the beginning, really, of the story of Irish austerity. Actually, I'm lying to you. It's not the beginning of the story of Irish austerity, but it is the beginning of the most humiliating phase of the Irish austerity, which is the arrival of, foreign bodies to take over the management of the Irish government. These are not people that these are not entities that the Irish people elected to govern. So this is not a democratic outcome, right? The national newspaper of Ireland, the newspaper of record, is the Irish Times, and they wrote of this moment, the arrival of the Troika in 2011, I think it was, right at the end of 2010 into 2011. And I quote, "There is the shame of it all. Having obtained our political independence from Britain to be the masters of our own affairs, we have now surrendered our sovereignty to the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund." And so I think there was really, in the popular national mind, there was a real kind of like awe, just profound awe at the scale of the problem that had been uncovered. The government was issuing now promissory notes as a commitment to repay its own central bank on behalf of Anglo, which it had now nationalized, to the tune of 30.6 billion euros. But that wasn't the only story. There were a number of other institutions that needed help too. So the total cost of bailing out the Irish banking system was going to actually be more than 30.6 billion. It was going to be much closer to 69.7 billion, all said and done, by July of 2012, which is 45% of GDP. So really, for a country the size of Ireland, that is huge money. And actually, that figure, 69.7 billion, is not the full cost, because that's what Ireland had to borrow. But Ireland had to take out of its own savings in the National Pension Reserve Fund a further 21 billion. So total cost, all in, is something on the order of 90 billion. The bondholders are going to be due a huge chunk of that, and then billions on top of that, again, are going to have to go on interest repayments between now and March 2031, which is when these promissory notes were going to mature. So the IMF made a comment at the time that the Irish financial crisis was now officially the costliest, and I'm quoting here, in advanced economies since at least the Great Depression. So, that's the IMF. I mean, that's pretty definitive. That's not to say that the money that was projected was going to be the money that was going to be ended up paying, but actual estimated costs, definitely, again, less the pension fund money is still like close to 64 billion or something. So you can talk about the numbers, you can, try to figure them out. It's complex. But one point that I think needs emphasizing is, even the numbers that of the actual costs don't take into account the opportunity cost, as it's known, of the money the government would, of the investment the government would have otherwise been able to take advantage of, right? So that amount of money, it could have built roads, hospitals, schools, and all of that could and would, in any economy, generate further revenue, right? Because you're expanding your economy, you're deepening investment, and those are opportunities that will never be there now because that money's gone. So it's a moment of national shame. It's a moment where people are really evaluating with some sorrow the lost opportunity. So there are negative connotations then in terms of people sort of associating the Troika here, because the Troika had refused to allow Ireland to burn the bondholders in any way, shape or form. A lot of people blame the Troika, but as a lot of observers say, Ireland had already started down the road of austerity prior to the arrival of the Troika. One analyst, Conor McCabe, has looked at this quite a bit, and he says, he notes, for example, a number of policies the government had already introduced. Now, not all of them were very well thought out. For example, early on in October 2008, the government tried to introduce means testing for medical care, which would have really affected the elderly. And the result was, one of the biggest protests that had been seen up to that point in time of just, older Irish people, elderly Irish people, marching and protesting in the streets of downtown Dublin. And of course, there's nothing that's going to be worse press for a government than seeing that on the streets. So the government backed down on that one, but it was already an early indication that the government was keen on this plan or program of fiscal consolidation, of cutting back, of engaging in austerity. And if the old people were going to be not good public relations to go after, then, maybe there would be segments of the population that would be less likely to protest and, for whom there would be less sympathy. So, where this was going to go, you can kind of join the dots. It's important to note that there were a lot of people that were very critical of this at the time. You had economists like the New York Times economist Paul Krugman, and Joe Stiglitz, who we've read in class, expressing very strong criticisms of this. And they, along with a range of domestic voices, including a number of trade unions, were really sort of calling for a more Keynesian approach, right, an integrated approach that would have put stimulus at the core of the problem, at the core of the recovery. Trying to sort of use government spending to generate jobs, to generate growth. And because you're generating growth, you'd bring back investment. That's something we learn in Mark Blyth. But my point simply here is that, to sort of, again, return to Conor McCabe, that there was a sense that austerity was already on the menu before the Troika arrived. And given that austerity was, in this sense, kind of homegrown before the Troika had come along, it's fair to ask what difference the Troika made in the government strategy, what difference the EU made in the government strategy. To what extent is it fair to blame or to be angry with the EU? Well, I think to answer that question, it's better to take a step back from the immediate question of the Troika itself, because the Troika was sort of a fait accompli. The bigger question with the European Union is what was going on in the years before the financial crisis, and did the European Union have a role or involvement in that? And of course they did. It's worth noting that until the mid-1980s, the Irish banking system was actually one of the most heavily regulated systems in Europe. Ireland's reputation as the Wild West of European financial government wouldn't really be developed until after the deregulation was introduced with the 1993 European single market, as I've argued. So I think if you have anger towards the European Union, it's probably more in a contextual sense. One of the things Yanis Varoufakis argues is that there's no tax and transfer system. It's something we've talked about before. If you're going to put a single currency in place, you need a tax and transfer system in order to take the profits from the core economy and redistribute them to the periphery. Otherwise, you end up with a two-tier economy. And what happens then is the surplus capital in the core starts to look for speculative investments in the periphery. And of course, it goes without saying, if you know anything about this at all, that these bondholders that we've been referring to were often from the core countries, right? They were German pension funds, for example, who were looking for a profitable return on the Irish property market. They thought that was the way to go. And Germans, as Mark Blythe tells us, aren't really borrowers. So Irish population, very young, looking for buying their first home, what have you. An expanding economy needs a lot of commercial property development. The Irish market seemed like a really good opportunity. So there's definitely some criticism to be offered and directed towards the European Union here, to be sure, no doubt about it. Anyway, this all aside, the European Union clearly wanted to create a firewall to prevent further contagion of the European market and keep the problem contained within Ireland. So that was a premium concern for them, and that's why they denied Ireland the right to burn the bondholders. So we're angry with the EU, possibly for the reasons that the euro itself was not very well thought through. We're possibly angry at the Troika for denying Ireland the right to burn the bondholders. And why? Because this basically meant that the banks were going to be nationalized without defaulting, which meant that the risks that they had taken were now the risks getting passed on to the Irish people. And that is going to prolong the hardship for Ireland, right? It's going to prolong the uncertainty, because it means that that debt is going to hang over the Irish people. It could have been written off. Had the bondholders been burned, it would have taken care of things a lot more quickly, and the bondholders themselves probably could have found solutions and worked out solutions with their own governments domestically, right? Why does that necessarily need to be the Irish people's fault, so to speak, is another way to put it. So about a third then of this new debt could be blamed on the bank bailout, as some people have argued, again, to do with that opportunity cost. The way debt disproportionately affects a country on the financial markets, a sudden arrival of a big, massive sort of debt bomb like that, it means that it's not simply going to be a question of the fiscal picture of what's going on in a country's balance of payments. You're going to have a disproportionate sort of impact in terms of the cost of borrowing. So what the Troika's aggressive approach had actually done then was it meant that Ireland was going to sort of suffer even more on its balance of payments than it would have otherwise suffered. That's not to say the Irish weren't without responsibility. Definitely, I think fiscal avenues could have been explored. that would have offset what were otherwise deflationary strategies. So, the Irish government has always ranked quite poorly in terms of its what's known as the social wage. In other words, in terms of social services. This was an opportunity to potentially generate some economic growth. This was the fiscal stimulus, the Keynesian strategy that we've been talking about. Those strategies weren't pursued. So, to summarize, I think what the timeline of the implementation of austerity has shown us is that, there's definitely responsibility to pass around. There's a deep structural responsibility of the way the European Union is set up. There's the fact that the Troika didn't allow Ireland to burn the bondholders. And then there's the domestic responsibility that there was just no real strategy on the government's part to do anything other than cut, right? It was a purely fiscal or monetary, strategy. There was no effort to engage in fiscal stimulus whatsoever. So just moving along now to the last few slides here. I think we've got 3 to go. This hardship notwithstanding, it's important to kind of look at why the government didn't take advantage of the options that were in front of it more fully. And partially that is to do with the fact that there was no real pressure on them from below, right? That there was no real pressure on them in the media. There was no real pressure on them from the electorate, frankly. So we're going to have to wait until 2015, 2016 to see anything like that pressure, because that's when the protests began. But in the meantime, the 2011 election, while the electorate did punish the party that was in power, all they really did was elect the other main party, which actually policy-wise, for very particular reasons to do with Irish history, isn't really that different. Ireland's political cleavage is not a left-right cleavage like it is in the States or in Europe, on the continent. In fact, it's a cleavage that's to do with the civil war that Ireland had in the 20s, much to do with the status of the north of Ireland. So, it's not a good structure really to sort of mash out strong different policy distinctions. And so for that reason then, it shouldn't surprise us that the new government, the Fine Gael government that came in 2011, basically continued the principles, the policies that the government had introduced in the first place. So there's a number of different threads we can pull on here that Fianna Fáil had already started prior to the arrival of the Troika, but which pulled on common threads in the sort of genealogy, as I was saying in the introduction, of the way the Irish economy has been thought about nationally. So the first thread, of course, is the we all partied thread. I mentioned that in the introduction, which, of course, amounts effectively to a retrospective reframing of the Celtic Tiger period as one characterized by pretty much universal irresponsibility. The second one, which I've also, I think, sort of alluded to already in the introduction, was the we are where we are theme. And this is simply, if you know any of the criticism of neoliberalism, this is an argument that there is no alternative, right? The so-called TINA, or TINA narrative. And then finally you have this kind of rallying around the flag, or we are all in this together narrative. Think about the London Blitz, right? During World War II, people of London pulled together. Despite all their differences, they realized the nation was confronted by an enormous challenge, and so this was the third part of the narrative that was being faced, that Irish media and Irish government elites were perpetuating. And the basic idea is that there's going to be collective sacrifices necessary if the nation is ever going to return to prosperity here at all. Now, As I've been trying to argue to you, this sort of thing goes back quite a ways. You can find a lot of worry throughout the decades since the founding of in government sources, worrying about the culture of dependency that can be brought on by a nation borrowing too much or having too much welfare, for example. How this undermines individual initiative, how it undermines entrepreneurialism, that kind of thing. There's a famous speech from 1981, what some have called, what some Irish conservatives sort of refer to as the best political speech of the country's sort of modern history, where the minister of Industry, Commerce and Tourism, John Kelly, referred to the entrepreneur as, in a way, the quintessential human being, and castigated the spirit of those that would want to hold back this entrepreneur as being proponents of what's called demand democracy, right? So what's demand democracy? It's like gimme, 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 right? And he said that people like that were akin to allowing the state to be rent, and I'm quoting here, rent by a pharaoh of cannibal piglets. So there you go. The people who are asking for demand democracy are, for John Kelly, a pharaoh of cannibal piglets. What wonderful rhetoric there. So, all that just to say that there's a kind of a deeper history of thinking austerity is a good thing for people, that it disciplines, for want of a better term, lazy people or people who don't take initiative. Now, David McWilliams, who we've already talked about as being an advisor to the government in previous slides, I think is a sort of a fascinating figure here as well, because he is kind of in some of his writings a bridge between older generations who are articulated those ideas and modern generations. And so, prior to the beginning of the 2008 recession, one of the well-known books on the Irish economy in the popular economics section of your bookstores would have been his book, All the Pope's Children. Now, what is this book? It's actually a devastating critique of the impact of financial success on the moral fiber of the country's population. So, as I said before, this guy is kind of a rock star, and his books were selling 100,000 copies easy, and they were having documentaries made of them. So he's really in the public eye, and he's a high impact person then in terms of like explaining basic economic ideas to people. One of the things he says is that the Celtic tiger, had growth that was literally unprecedented for developed countries, and it's worth explaining, he says, how this came about, and he talks about this phenomena really as being grounded in a massive growth of the Irish population that took place in the 1970s, and which peaked in June 1980. And he says 9 months to the day after the famous 1979 visit of Pope John Paul II. Now, put two and two together there, right? Pope John Paul, Catholic Pope, very strong views on contraception. Everyone gets religion. In 1979, 9 months to the day later, you have a massive spike in the Irish birth rate, and that's where the title of the book comes from, All the Pope's Children. It's, I guess, an ironic title for a book. Now, who are these Pope's children then, right? It's a generation of Irish people that are notable, he argues, not least because, in contrast with previous generations, these were not Irish people that were going to leave the country. Previously, Irish people have always left the country. The Irish population has remained very static since the potato famine, in fact, in the middle of the 18th or 19th century. To this day, actually, the Irish population hasn't really recovered to what it used to be. So these children of the Pope, so to speak, are unique because they're the ones that are going to grow up in an Ireland that was coming out of recession in the 1980s, and where new types of credit are starting to flow in, and it's a very different economy than it was in previous eras. So it was also in Ireland that had kind of shrugged off some of the ideological power of conservative forces in the country, like the Catholic Church. Typically that had been an issue in the past. Close state-church collaboration on education and healthcare certainly has been a feature of Irish history as an independent state, and then out of this Ireland, this new kind of culturally diverse Ireland, with the European Union encouraging Irish government to relax its barriers to trade with other nations of Europe, you're starting to see new goods and services coming into the country, people having, if you will, decadent desires. Not my words, but David McWilliams describes it in those terms. And so these Pope's children then are growing up in a very different Ireland, and they're going to be a kind of something Ireland has never seen before, a creative force, a dynamic force, entrepreneurial perhaps, but definitely with new tastes and desires, right? So all of this is going to be funded by these German wealth funds, right? The German bondholders, as I've explained to you, that were going to throw all this cash money, credit money into the Irish banks, and the Irish banks are going to lend this money out, are, it's German pension funds that this is coming from. So it's a kind of a weird thing. The German pensioners probably don't know this, but the money that they're giving indirectly to the Irish banks is going to end up fueling what McWilliams calls the expectocracy, and he's quite serious about his language here. I quote, this is a quote from the book, a generation of acquisitive, ambitious, oversexed, drug-snorting, shallow 30-somethings. Yes, they're going to be talented. Yes, they're going to be productive at work, very disciplined in some respects, but they're going to keep themselves fit, for example. But at the end of the day, these are people that have lost all sort of sense of religion. They're very secular, and they are basically craven materialists, right? So, they're going to have lawnmower envy, right? They're going to be looking over the neighbor's yard and trying to check out what's going on over there, kind of thing. Oh, they got a new shiny chrome toaster over there. I better get one of those. So it's going to be a generation defined by its pursuit of personal gratification. So following this framing, of course, it's problematic, right? I mean, these are not my views at all, but this is McWilliams's kind of, as I said, bridge between the conservative voices of the previous generations in Ireland, and in a sense establishing the rhetorical tone that's going to characterize, that's going to provide the rhetoric and the vocabulary to characterize what happened in the financial crisis. And right, you can see how the "we all partied" notion is going to be circulated. So following this framing, then, those who would refuse to confess their sort of sinful ways clearly are going to be in need of some discipline. So when the financial crisis itself happens, a number of points are going to be asserted by the government and by the media elites, including a targeting of any sectors of the Irish economy that were resisting austerity. And one of those, of course, was the Irish public sector. And as Kieran Allen notes, one of the great popular post-Celtic Tiger economic myths that had circulated was that Irish workers are generally overpaid. Now, Allen, who's an economist in his own right, argues that this is actually quite a problematic conclusion. He cites a lot of data to show that Irish workers are actually not that well paid at all. But there's a second myth that is closely associated with that first myth of the Irish being overpaid, and that is that it has a bloated public sector where pay and job security are too high for government employees, for people that work in any way, shape, or form connected to the government. So this introduces an interesting point for us, because while the public sector itself in no way, shape, or form can be argued to have caused the crash. The protection that it enjoys, because it's one of the very few sectors that has a sort of a union density, it's seen as a protected sector, and because it's protected, it's shielded from the corrective market pressures of austerity, right? And the whole nation needs these pressures, according to this mantra, right? The Pope's Children mantra. Everyone needs this market discipline because we're crazy party animals, and we need the discipline. So I could, at this point in the lecture, go through a lot of sort of reasons why that's not true. If you want, I can suggest for you looking at Kieran Allen's work in some more detail, and there's other people I can suggest there as well. But I'll skip that just because I want to kind of get to the point, which is that this powerful Pope's Children discourse really starts to bear its teeth in the context of Irish austerity, and specifically in the way government policy was changed and modified to deal with the public sector. Now, Ireland had to that point in time what was known as a social partnership model. Now, what that meant was that, coming out of the 1980s, the government and union leadership had kind of decided to try to address Ireland's competitive situation in globalization by agreeing to cut costs of labor for Irish manufacturing, for Irish exports, for foreign businesses that wanted to move to Ireland to set up production, for example. And they were going to do that by giving up. The unions were going to give up their traditional adversarial posture, and were going to start kind of like cooperating, basically. So this meant that centralized national bargaining could be introduced. And there's a lot of case studies that I could talk to you about which really sort of indicate how this centralized national bargaining was going to work. But basically, to put a sort of make a long story short, what it meant was that over time, because the union leadership of Irish unions was sort of unwilling to really sort of engage seriously with strike action, over time, it meant that more and more the workers were going to be losing out. They were going to find themselves marginalized. And what this meant was that membership of unions was going to be disenchanted, and this is my point, and they would leave the union, right? So why would you be in a union if a union can't really protect your job? So it's the weakness of the unions, and the unions already sort of being involved in social partnership and agreeing to not be combative, that meant that when the government started to experience the financial hardship in 2008 on its balance sheets, that it could largely pass on the costs to public sector workers. So, for example, there was a 15% wage cut on public sector workers in 2009, and that was, not really resisted by the unions. Their response was to try to negotiate with government, but of course the government wasn't really in a position to negotiate. The unions weren't going to go on strike. They couldn't bring any pressure. So there was some concern at the time. Eventually, I suppose you'd say that the negotiations of the social bargaining sort of needed a new direction to help sort of find a new platform for moving forward under austerity. So the solution was going to be what was known as Croke Park. It was going to be a new deal that was going to cover the austerity period. The unions, some of them didn't like it, but a slim majority of them agreed, and so eventually, basically, they all went along with it. But critically, again, remember, the unions I'm arguing to you have sort of been non-combative through this whole process. So, I mean, some strikes and things, but nothing major, right? So, most importantly, Crow Park was going to seal in a condition where the workers would agree not to go on strike. And so this meant that, again, there would be no sort of infrastructure, no organized infrastructure for Irish people to express a counter opinion to the Pope's children language. And so what I'm trying to say is that the dominant discourse of the day then, which was again to do with these unruly subjects of the Pope's children, would capture the national imagination. And the unions, in their defeat and in their agreement to be cooperative with government, weren't going to be in a position to really challenge that. So that explains partially why the Irish were seen as being sort of compliant in this whole process. Now, what we have to sort of conclude on then is that throughout the 2014 and 2015 period, after the Troika has left and restored Irish autonomy, and even though the 2016 election is quite far off, Irish politicians, mainstream politicians, I think were starting to smell the winds changing, right? That they detected or perceived that there was a sort of a turn in the national sentiment. And while Irish people didn't necessarily associate their anti-austerity sentiments with left-wing ideas, the government began to use kind of, if you're familiar with the term McCarthyism, this was like the term that was used to describe the anti-communist purges of Senator Joseph McCarthy in the United States after World War II. So that term McCarthyism today is still used as a kind of a reference to a method or a political maneuver where you start to, cause alarm in a society about the penetration of socialists or communists or what have you. Sometimes it's more hot air than fact, and I think in the Irish context, certainly, the media really started to sort of turn on the left and accuse them of being, Trotskyists and this kind of thing with secret agendas. Now, it was a somewhat predictable thing, right? Because with the country's financial woes kind of behind it and people starting to come up for air now, the government had overseen all this austerity and, basically didn't really have a good platform for its legitimacy moving forward. All it could say was, yeah, we inflicted this hardship on you, but, we still need to have hard work yet left to do, and we need stability now. So the mantra of stability or chaos became kind of pervasive. And I think, they knew that with the election coming at some point between 2015 and 2016, they would need to take seriously these potential leftist threats. Yeah. So another factor that can be thought about here is the fact that in the 2014 period, 2015 period, you see the success of a left-wing party in Greece in resisting European austerity. Now, Syriza would ultimately be defeated by the European Union and brought into the fold and would implement austerity, would be made to implement austerity, frankly. But at the time, Syriza was still a very impressive political party, impressive political formation. I think so on the strength of all of that, in 2014, late 2014, you start to see a fairly significant momentum in the social movement scene and a number of protests, specifically in and around the question of Irish water, right? And so one of the umbrella groups that's organized to drive these protests is called Right to Water. And what had caused this? Well, in 2014, the Irish government had announced plans to institute a new water tax, which was going to, depending on the size of your household, end up charging you anywhere from 176 euros a month to potentially 500 euros a month. So for a lot of people, middle class people who'd already been suffering from cutbacks on their budget, who had already lost their jobs perhaps, or families that had had maybe 2 jobs now only had 1, and they were still trying to pay their mortgage, water charges, were going to be fairly difficult to stomach. So, and of course, there were still all these ongoing controversies about corruption. So for example, at the start of 2014, especially in relation to Irish Water, the government revealed that they had, in setting up this tax for water, nationalized all the local systems, a plan to nationalize all the local systems in a semi-state body that was going to be called Irish Water. And there were real worries about the amount of consultancy fees that were being contributed to this. And it looked like behind the scenes that maybe the government had a plan and was drawing up plans to privatize this. And there was suspicion that that's what the European Union wanted Ireland to do. So, I think people were just genuinely worried that, the austerity was kind of getting ridiculous, and that it was going to be the difference between whether people could, put bread on the table or not. So the government cranked up, ratcheted up the rhetoric. The McCarthyist rhetoric really gets kind of turned up. And the government starts talking about, fascists and elitists trying to stir up left-wing sentiment, specifically targeting individuals like Paul Murphy, for example. But it's important not to get too hung up on what the government was doing, because, in fact, while the government was targeting specific individuals and sort of labeling them as left-wing or fascist or what have you, Trotskyists, actually a lot of the resistance to this was really local and quite spontaneous, and it was not that it was quite far beyond what the organized left could have organized on its own. So at the community level, for example, people were working together to engage in kind of acts of casual terrorism, for want of a better word, civil disobedience, it might be another way to put it. They, for example, were obstructing the contractors that were being sent to their homes to install the meters, because Irish Water had not been metered at the household level to that point in time. It had been metered at the community level because it was basically free and you were paying for it out of your taxes. That's not something that Americans are familiar with, because most American households have had water meters for quite a long time. But this was something that was unusual in Ireland, not being heard of before. So in the same breath, mysterious water fairies were cropping up around the country that were, distributing on YouTube, for example, instructional videos that showed people how to pour concrete into the meters and sabotage them. So, clearly there was kind of like a groundswell of momentum around this. And then, of course, finally, above all, I mean, frankly, people were not paying the charge. 70% of households refused to pay the charge itself. So for observers, this was indeed a kind of a kicking off of a new type of citizenship, right? A new type of social movement that was kind of unprecedented in Irish politics. So anyway, all of this was going down before the 2016 election, and this was really a remarkable election, because after 4 years of austerity, the parties in charge, the Labour Party and Fine Gael, really got decimated. Fine Gael lost 20 seats, and the Labour Party suffered its worst election performance in its history. Now, Fianna Fáil, the other party, did regain some of its ground, but not enough to reverse the decline that they had experienced in 2011. So now the two major parties have basically fallen. And what's going to happen in Irish politics? Well, between the three of them, well, maybe not Labour, but definitely between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, there's going to be a kind of a weird alliance formed, right? Something people have sort of thought Irish politics has needed for a very long time. But it's not going to have, neither party's going to have an absolute majority. So they're going to pull in a lot of independent voters, independent members of parliament rather, and the Irish parliament is going to kind of like stumble on as a kind of a zombie, for want of a better term. People use this term a lot, they call it zombie politics. So it can't be understated that this idea of a kind of a coalition between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would, be countenanced. This is something that people wouldn't even have imagined in previous decades. So it definitely was, that in itself was something of a Berlin Wall moment, that these two parties were actively cooperating. But of course, in the same breath, giving the impression that they were not a coalition and that they were not, power sharing in any way, shape, or form. They were maintaining some rhetoric of rivalry and opposition to each other in the parliament. But nevertheless, Fianna Fáil clearly has been, since the election, propping up Fine Gael policy. So what's going on here? I suppose there's a number of factors at play. The first is the decline or the diminishment of Civil War politics. Secondly, which we haven't mentioned but deserves mentioning, was the amount of left-wing members of the Irish Parliament that there are now. Sinn Féin, which is a party that has very confused associations in the minds of most Irish voters, is increasingly these days a left-wing party. It has associations with Northern Ireland and the struggle of the IRA, which I'm not going to make comments on in this lecture, but definitely there's a lot of people that worry about where Sinn Féin's real politics lie. But Sinn Féin today is not the Sinn Féin then. Those politicians have slowly been shifting off the scene, those sort of politicians that have associations with terrorism, and there's a strong sense now that Sinn Féin, there's people that would be very critical of what I'm about to say, but the comparison would be with the ANC in South Africa and Nelson Mandela. That party was once a terrorist party and yet came into mainstream political life to try to make a contribution through that type of politics instead of the other type of politics, having achieved its goals. And so too Sinn Féin, definitely nowadays starting to assert a much more overtly left-wing critique of Irish political life than it would have in the past, and becoming associated in many people's minds with the anti-austerity agenda. So possibly what you're looking at is a re-articulation as a result of austerity of Irish politics, and as a result of the Eurozone not being adequately balanced, which I think ultimately is what caused the financial crisis, that you're actually seeing a major change in the configuration of Irish political life, away from that dichotomy or cleavage around the Civil War politics to something much more about left-wing versus right-wing politics, left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, as you have here in the United States. It's going to be a modern ideological distinction as opposed to a distinction grounded in nuanced questions about the fate of the nation. Now, there's a lot of other things that can still play out here that can be influencing factors. I haven't mentioned Brexit. We'll talk about that later this semester. The British exit of the European Union, I think, is going to have major ramifications for Ireland because of the the fact that Ireland is the only country that has a land border with the United Kingdom in the north. So that could be a factor. There's a number of other things that could be a factor, but that was basically my lecture for today, guys. So I hope it was beneficial for you, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.